I'm gonna do it here. Let me come back out. Hey, hi.
Hey, Tina.
Are you doing all right?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, good. We have a little bit of a small group here. There may be a few more wondering in as we're going. But I really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much for your time and for arranging for Max and all that. I really appreciate it. So this is a few people from different classes that I have here on campus, as well as it looks like we've got a back row of faculty and staff here too. So you had an interest in it as well. So I'm super excited that you're here today, and I've talked to the students just a little bit, and that you're going to be sharing a little bit of your history and what it's like to be living with what you do. So I want to go ahead and turn it over to you. This is Karren Johnson. I was going to say, it is. I think I sent out an email at Karen Ham. Can you believe that?
That's okay.
I have to explain, I went to high school with Karen, so she was Karen Ham when I went there. But it's Karen Johnson now, sorry about that. So
that's okay.
Okay, so Karen, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to you, and some people will be wondering in as you're talking. So thank you again.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, it's all you.
Okay. So how I usually begin describing what my journey has been like is I usually take people back to 2008, and I was a master's student working on my master's in sociology, and I woke up in a hospital in Denver, and I did not know how I had ended up there. I looked at the side table, and I thought I had recognized some of the clothing, but I wasn't exactly sure. So I was completely lost as to how I'd gotten there. I was pretty much baffled. So I walked out into the hallway, and I ran into this red-haired gentleman, and he had a stethoscope, which I assumed he was a doctor, which seemed like, well, he would have knowledge or might know what's going on. And he's like, "Whoa, Miss Johnson, you're up. It's so good to see you." And I was just like, "So you've seen me before. This is some good information." And so I asked him, where I was, and he's like, "Well, you're outside of Denver, and you're at such and such hospital." And I'm like, "Well, how did I get here?" And he explained that I had had 11 treatments of electroconvulsive therapy, what we commonly call ECT, or what you may know as shock therapy. A lot of people call it shock therapy. And I was driving my car to school, and I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was driving my car to school, and I just kept driving and ended up in Denver, where I ran out of gas. And I didn't know who I was or where I was, and so I ended up at this hospital. And eventually my husband was able to find me, and but I didn't know who he was in the beginning. It took me a while to figure out who he was. And in this process, I lost about 3 years of memory. And I still have some memory issues. And this was it was quite an event. I'm working on my thesis at the time, and luckily I had really good notes, so I was able to go back and restart that work and things like that. Now, why was I going through electroconvulsive therapy? Well, I actually live with schizoaffective disorder, which is a blending of, you have schizophrenia, and it's blended with a mood disorder. So you have the affective part. For me, it's blended with bipolar disorder. So I have a blending of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And what had happened was I had entered into a depressive cycle that had left me pretty much catatonic. I had gotten to a point where I wasn't able to get out of bed. My husband had to help me get dressed, things like that. Medication wasn't helping. So at that point, they usually recommend ECT. And so that's what had led to that. And, I've lived with this disorder and symptoms of it actually since childhood. So it was nothing really new that I had been dealing with this, but it's just one of those things that you try something and you never know if it's going to work or not. For me, it didn't work. But now in order to manage that illness, I also live with obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. I am on a medication cocktail, and recently I was diagnosed with a cognitive disorder, which is not unusual for someone that lives with one of a type of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia over time does impact your cognitive ability, and so you will start having memory impairments. It's almost like the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, and so you'll have difficulty recalling words. Short-term memory becomes very difficult. You will have to repeat conversations, and so as part of that cocktail, I'm actually on an Alzheimer's medication as well. So that is how I manage it now, is through a cocktail of medications. And as another way to manage it is, I have to see a psychiatrist once a month. My husband keeps tabs on my mood and different behaviors, because a lot of times I'm not the best person to kind of be the best to monitor that. And it's difficult, but it's definitely manageable. It's something that you can live with. Up until recently, I taught at the college level, and up until I was diagnosed with a cognitive disorder, I was able to teach. And so, but now with the cognitive disorder, it kind of changes things. So what I'd like to actually ask now, what kind of questions do you have about medications and that you have to take for this type of disorder? Any questions?
Karen, I was wondering if you might be able to speak. Have you had success with them? Do you find that you have to go by trial and error? How does that work for you?
It is a lot of trial and error. I have been on it feels like almost every medication out there as you're trying to find a blending, because I take 5 different medications that are in this cocktail, and it is trial and error. And there's always difficulties with side effects. Like one of the medications I take is lithium for mood stabilization. And lithium has some difficult side effects. I've developed a hand tremor. It's also one thing you have to be very careful with lithium is that the therapeutic level is close to the toxic level. And so you have to have blood draws to make sure that you're within that therapeutic range and not getting too high or too low. And so, some different drugs, you have to have blood draws. Some medication can make you very drowsy. And so, you have to be able to basically be able to regulate your sleep, make sure that you can get enough sleep. And things like that. One of the antipsychotics I was on, I'm going to say probably 3 medications ago, which is Zyprexa. It's really linked to weight gain, and I had a horrible time with it. And one of the reasons it's linked to weight gain is it can induce what's called insulin resistance, and it's not diabetes. You're still producing insulin, but what happens is that your body stops recognizing the insulin, and so you're resistant to it. And so if you take in any sugar, say you indulge in a Pepsi, which I have a weak spot for Pepsis, and so you indulge in a Pepsi, your body's not recognizing the insulin, so it's not using the insulin to process the sugar from that Pepsi, and so it's just immediately being turned into fat. And so on Zyprexa, I gained a lot of weight. Before my pregnancy, I finally switched me to another antipsychotic, and fortunately, it didn't have the same effect on me. It worked better with my chemistry, and I was able to lose a little over 100 pounds. And so you really have to, there is the trial and error part. You have to find things that work with your chemistry. Right now, the antipsychotic I'm on is Invega, and it is working really well for me. It's not making me too drowsy. One of the things when I was on Seroquel is Seroquel was highly effective for me, but what we kind of would call the hangover of it, the drowsiness of it was just not working with having a toddler. Trying to get up in the morning and take care of a little human being with the hangover of Seroquel, it wasn't working, and this is where you have to have a good relationship with your doctor. You have to say, I'm responsible for this little human, and here I am barely able to function in the morning because of this medication. And so then you have to do the trial and error. And they're making headway all the time in medication. So like with Invega, now that we found that Invega doesn't have that hangover for me, I'm actually going to be starting Invega injections, where once a month I have a shot of Invega, and it keeps Invega as a solid dose in my system where I don't have any spikes or anything, and will help keep me more stable than I already am. And so you really have to have that open communication, and it is trial and error. As I said, Seroquel was highly effective for the symptoms, but the side effect wasn't doable as a mom.
What was it like for you with your medications when you were pregnant?
That was difficult. I could be on some medications and I couldn't be on others. There's a misconception that you can't be on any medications whatsoever, and that's not true. You can be on some of your medications. It really depends on the individual medication, and it also depends on the time, the part of your pregnancy. So it was very difficult. Like for instance, the first 2 trimesters of my pregnancy, I could not be on lithium because it interrupts the development of the heart of the fetus. And so we looked for other medications to help with different parts of the mood swings to help me through that. It wasn't as beneficial, but it was ways kind of to patch me through it. I had to be in contact with, I was still teaching at the time, and I had to be in contact with my employer why, if I had to miss a class session and couldn't teach, such things like that. And then when we got to that 3rd trimester and the heart of the fetus was completely formed, completely fine, we were able to add back in the lithium, and then go ahead and have a solid lithium level going before I even gave birth to help with any postpartum issues. So what I would say to people that live with severe mental illness and they want to be a parent and they're worried about the medication is that it's possible, but you have to find a doctor that you trust and can communicate with and that's willing to do the research to find the right medication to help you through, and that's willing to meet. I was meeting with my psychiatrist every 2 weeks during my pregnancy, and I was also going to a center for prenatal development to be further monitored. So I was having quite a few sonograms and that to make sure that the development of the fetus was going okay. Now, one thing I'd like to share is when I first became pregnant, I was seeing a psychiatrist that is very into medicinal marijuana, and kept trying to convince me a lot of times that medicinal marijuana would be better than my antipsychotics, and I wasn't buying it. And for me, it's like, for other people, if that's what works for them, fine, whatever. But for me, I was like, why do I want something that would even could possibly give me more hallucinations? I really didn't see the benefit here. And when I became pregnant, he said, well, I would feel more comfortable if you were on cannabis than any of your antipsychotics. And we kind of had a line in the sand there, whereas that he wanted me to go on the medicinal marijuana program instead of prescribing me the medication for my illness. And so it was kind of like at that point I was like, evidently we have two different ideas about how to treat my illness and we're not communicating. I don't want to take marijuana and that's all you're offering me. And so I went and found a psychiatrist that was willing to do the research and go through and treat me in a way that I felt comfortable. And a lot of times you have to be your own advocate, because I just didn't feel comfortable smoking marijuana while pregnant. It just didn't work for me. But I had to be my own advocate for it. And that can be very tiring and very difficult when you're living with a mental illness, to be the one that has to be your own advocate. But you have to.
Karren, you had alluded to when you were just talking there about your worries about marijuana giving you further hallucinations. Could you describe some of the symptoms that you have with your illnesses?
With the schizoaffective disorder, I deal with hallucinations and delusions, and of course the mood swings with the bipolar part. The hallucinations, one thing I would like to state with hallucinations is that basically any of your senses that you have, you can hallucinate with. So what I mean by that is any of your five senses, anything you can hear, see, smell, taste, touch, anything like that, you can have a hallucination. I've had olfactory hallucinations before, where I know I'm smelling something in particular, and then I become obsessed with it, and I'm searching for it. So that's something to think about. But with my hallucinations, I've dealt with things such as what my doctor's nice calls shadow people. I can't see the details of them, but I see shadow people like in my home. And then with delusions, these are like false beliefs or false ideas, or sometimes some paranoid ideas that may lead you to certain behaviors. And so, it's very easy to become very paranoid as to you know, everyone's talking about you, and you know, I'll give you an example. My husband and I have been married twice, and we got married. A year later, we were divorced, full divorce, and then about a year and a half later after that, we were married again. And there's a reason why, and that was about a year into the marriage. I was certain that he was basically trying to get me. He was going to steal my CDs. He was an evil person. I was paranoid of him. There was a lot of things I was paranoid about. I had a lot of paranoid ideas about him, and that we had to get a divorce. This wasn't meant to be. And so, much to his surprise, it's just all of a sudden I'm just like, I'm moving out. We can't be married. We were never meant to be. I can't be with you. And he's just like, where did this come from? I don't know what's going on. And I was adamant. And there's a store here in Albuquerque that sells divorce kits. I went and bought a divorce kit. I filled it out. I borrowed some money from my grandmother. I went and paid the fee, and we were divorced. And my husband is like completely bewildered by the whole experience. He's trying to figure out what the heck just happened. And then as I'm coming out of this, I'm like, well, I want to be with you. I totally miss you. And then he's just like, well, now I'm just confused. And so once I was on some medication and more stabilized, he did remarry me. Once we figured out what was going on, what was happening with why I was so paranoid about him. And with the mood swings, I have times of mania, where I can make really poor decisions with money, with relationships, and times of depression, suicide attempts, times when getting out of bed just isn't possible, aspects like that. Now with the OCD, I've dealt with that since childhood. Everything from having to look at a billboard and repeat what it says over and over again perfectly, and breathe the right amount of times between the amount of times I recite what the billboard says, to saying a certain prayer perfectly over and over again, or believing that I have to close my eyes while driving. During that period of obsession, I had to stop driving. I've had almost every symptom of OCD. It wasn't until I discovered Celexa that I started to get some freedom from my OCD. But we had gone through almost every medication before we found something that helped me with my OCD. And with the PTSD, what happens there is you are on guard all the time, and you have a really exaggerated startle response. If when I was at work, if someone came around the corner in the hallway, all of a sudden I'd jump up and be really startled. Now, another thing is, a lot of times you have really drastic thoughts. Like if my son starts crying in the middle of the night, all of a sudden my thought is, there must be someone in his room with a gun to his head, and so I'm like sneaking into his room so I can get the perpetrator, and all it is that my son wants his mom. There's no one there. But that's what happens with PTSD. Any other questions?
How do you cope with identifying when and how to disclose your illness to others?
That's a very good question. A long time ago, I was pretty secretive about it. And it's one thing I kind of figured out was that a lot of times people are going to find out, and so I'm pretty open and honest about it. Now that doesn't mean that I haven't paid prices for that. There was one place I worked that after being in the hospital for, I believe it was for a medication management. I had been in the hospital so they could readjust the medication. I came back, and next thing you know, they asked me to sign a letter of resignation. And so, because the stigma is there, stigma is very strong. And when I applied for grad school, I graduated with my bachelor's from the University of New Mexico, and I had done, I had some semesters where, because they would award in the GPA like a 4.33 if you had an A+ in the class. So there was some semesters I had over a 4.0. And I'd done really well on my GREs, and I applied for grad school at UNM, and the chair of the department there, he had some issues with people with mental illness, and they knew me in the department, and I wasn't accepted. And kind of a mentor of mine, she went and asked why, and he's like, well, she has a mental illness, she can't handle grad school. And so I went to Las Vegas, New Mexico, just north of Albuquerque, to New Mexico Highlands for my graduate degree. But, you know, I don't go around just automatically like telling people in line at Walgreens, you know, hey, you know, I have a mental illness. But with friends and that, and that I'm just open and honest about it. Also, another thing is when people make jokes about mental illness, or when they say something like that's so schizo or something like that, I've learned that if I don't say something like, well, actually, you're not using the term right, you know, as someone that lives with a form of schizophrenia, this is actually what that means, and that if you don't start educating people, the stigma is just going to continue. So I understand there's risks, but I think I just made a decision a long time ago just to go ahead and be honest and open about it.
Karren, speaking of the social stigma, would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about what went on when you decided to have Max?
Oh, that was interesting. You know, I think probably one of the best ways, kind of stories to kind of share about that is, I waited a long time to have a child. For a long time I wasn't going to have a child. Then all of a sudden, kind of at the last minute, I was like, oh, I want a kid. And so, because I'm 38, I'm going to be 39 in a couple weeks, and my son will be 2 in like 3 weeks. And my son was not quite 1, and I had gone to a faculty picnic, and I had not seen this this coworker since before my son was born. And I'm like, well, oh, this is Max, and da-da-da-da-da. And she's like, oh, Max. And then she just looks at me and she's like, aren't you afraid he'll get your disease? And I was just like, this is the first thing you say, not like, oh, cute kid, you know, or I like his shirt, or, you know, not something like that. It was, aren't you afraid he'll get your disease? And it's, there is a lot of social stigma about people with mental illness having children. Just one thing for you to try is go to Google and type into Google schizophrenic should and see what it offers you for fill-in, for automatic fill-in, because it does the autofill. And it will be things like schizophrenic should be sterilized, schizophrenic should be locked up, things like that. And the thing is, there's still that stigma there about what people with schizophrenia should and should not do. You know, the genetics are there. It's a tricky thing. My father is bipolar. My mother has schizophrenia. Her sister has schizophrenia. My grandmother has an anxiety disorder. The doctors have stated that I'm genetically loaded, so anything could happen with my son. But what's interesting, you know, that we kind of there was a lesson in that this past weekend. My son was in the hospital, and there's epilepsy on my husband's side, and it turns out my son was diagnosed with epilepsy this past weekend. And so, you know, my husband and I were like, well, you know, we knew there was a risk for either epilepsy on my side or mental illness on your side, and maybe what we got here was epilepsy and we won't get the mental illness. But it was you just never know. You can also have, the thing is, and I've written about this before, with mental illness, 1 + 1 does not always equal 2. Not always equal 2. You can have someone that's diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, any number of the mental illnesses, and there is no history whatsoever that anyone knows about in that family. Or you can have someone that has a family history like mine, and that gene doesn't get turned on in that person, and they don't deal with mental illness at all. So we don't know. We just don't know enough to know whether or not if it's 1 + 1 = 2, or if it's going to be 1 + 1 = 5. So we just don't know. And so, but there's a lot of people that have made decisions. Sarah Silverman, the comedian, she has a strong family history of depression, and she's lived with depression herself. And she had an interview. It was about the time I was going through my pregnancy. She had an interview where she said, "I will not have children because I'm too afraid of passing this on, and I don't want another person to go through what I've been through." And that's, everyone has their own, they're free to make that choice. Any other questions?
I'm curious too with the medications and some of the those treatments that you've accessed. Have there been other kinds of complementary technique or treatment kinds of things, therapies? I come from an OT background, so I'm just curious if there are other things that that have been a part of the hospitalizations that you've had and those kinds of things.
That's a very good question. And I have been hospitalized 12 times. And one thing, and actually when you asked that question, it kind of made me think of something that I should mention. I went through 10 years of cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT. And cognitive behavioral therapy has been priceless for me. And there's a reason why. And it's a way to reteach yourself to deal with certain issues. My therapist, she talked about how the reason she likes to do her work, she doesn't have children herself, but she says it's almost like she gets to reparent during her work. She says she doesn't feel like a parent to her patients, but she's like she gets to do some reparenting because she's teaching new skills, and it's very important. It's like, you know, when I talk about her, like when I would start to feel stabilized on my meds and then start thinking, oh, I can take out this lithium pill, I don't need it, and I can take out this pill, and I can start weaning myself off my meds, and then all of a sudden start having relapse. And then we would talk about, you know, some of the behavior issues here. You know, what are you causing yourself to do here? Why do you keep doing this, and get to the root of the behavior there, and talk about self-sabotage and how to avoid it, and really change some behavior there to stay med compliant, and how to deal with when you're dealing with, you know, extreme irritability. What are ways that you can deal with that extreme irritability to help yourself, you know, in the workplace or with family members or friends, and ways to take care of yourself. You know, what are some ways that you can take care of yourself so that you can, you know, stay med compliant, reduce your stress, because that's one thing that a lot of people don't know about, is that if your stress is too high, then sometimes it can impact the effectiveness of your medication. If you're not sleeping well enough, it can impact the effect of your medication. If you're not eating well, it can impact the effect of your medication. So the cognitive behavior therapy really teaches you how to take care of yourself and stop the behaviors that are sabotaging, and recognize when they're coming around. My therapist would talk about it as the merry-go-round, that same horse that would come around every once in a while, and you'd have to be reminded to stop that behavior and correct it when that happened. We also talked about, excuse my language, but we call it another fucking growth opportunity, but excuse my language. But it was interesting to work with her, and really look at the cognitive behavior therapy, like how we can change your behavior here for a better outcome here. And this is something that really I see missing in our mental health system, is that like if you go to the mental health center here in Albuquerque, and they have to deal with a large population. They're dealing with a really small budget, really small amounts of professionals, and a large population. But they don't have the funding for ongoing cognitive behavioral therapy or support groups or things like that for people that are diagnosed, to help them stay med compliant and deal with the behavior issues that come up, and how to deal with things like anxiety and irritability and sleep hygiene and things like that, and find support systems to help them. And so one thing I've been very fortunate with too is that I have my husband, who has been very supportive and has worked, you know, right beside me to help keep me on track. And there's so many people out there that don't have that, and that is just too, you know, we're asking people to take care of themselves without any support, and it's really a tragedy. We handle it really in the wrong way. We have to have the medication part, but we have to have these other therapies too. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank
Okay.
you. That makes me sad to our access to supports, of any kind, as it varies for individuals.
Well, it's like I recently was looking for, because there's Schizophrenia Anonymous, and we used to have a support group here in Albuquerque for Schizophrenia Anonymous, and it turns out that I decided that I wanted to start attending those meetings again, and the meetings have been disbanded like a little over a year ago, and so there's nothing here on an outpatient basis, even through the mental health center, for people that live with schizophrenia to meet once a week and just talk. And it's like, for me, I have friends, I have my husband. Okay, this was just something extra I wanted, but what are all those people that are so isolated, and what's going to keep them on their medication and keep them focused and help them monitor their behaviors and adapt their behaviors to taking care of themselves? It's baffling that we're expecting that.
It's very sad. I think that we see that here in Kansas as well, Karen. It's mental health is so underfunded.
Oh, yeah.
Karen, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your history of it. When did you know, or when did you have an inkling that something was going on?
Well, the OCD, I was having symptoms in grade school, and I didn't know it was OCD, of course, because I was in grade school, but I knew the obsession and how distressing is a good word, how distressing the different things I was having to do and do over and over again. I knew this wasn't right. Also, by the time I was 11, 12, I was having pretty severe depression. When I was 12, I took an overdose of aspirin. I saw on a TV talk show that someone had taken an overdose of aspirin, and that was a way that they were able to kill themselves. And so I thought that was a way that I would be able to kill myself. And instead, I made myself really, really sick, induced some hallucinations and that. By the time I get to junior high, I'm having periods of pretty strong. I'm having some mania every once in a while, and it was confusing because it was like I would have these surges of happiness isn't even the right word. It's just this energy, just like, wow, I'm on fire, and I couldn't talk fast enough to keep up with my thoughts. I'd sometimes start breathing like I couldn't breathe fast enough. I'd sometimes sweat. I would be like just in overdrive, and then all of a sudden it would just disappear. And it was, I just kind of think of it as like I ran out of happiness. It happened too fast, so I just ran out of it. And by the time I get to high school, I'm having delusional thoughts, a lot of irritability, and so I knew something was wrong. I told myself that if I make it through college, I'll go ahead and get some help for it, but I didn't know if I could make it because I would get so depressed that I was pretty suicidal. My second semester at college, I was very suicidal, and my boyfriend at the time, who's my husband now, took me into the student's mental health center, and by that point, I have a completely flat affect. I know I'm suspicious of my sorority sisters. I know that they're all out to get me. But I want to say I knew by like junior high that something just wasn't going right. That the things were pretty much off. And I burnt a lot of bridges because of this. It was hard to maintain friendships. Extreme irritability. Always feeling like people were like out to get you, or that it was very difficult. Any questions about that?
How were you able to, like, study and keep your grades up and stuff? Were you able to do all that okay? And
my grades yo-yoed. It's interesting. It took me 9 years to finish my bachelor's. And for the first half of my bachelor, it's like my first semester, it's a very high GPA. My second semester, it's a very low GPA. Luckily, it balanced out. By the time I transferred schools, when I transferred schools, I'm barely able to. My GPA is just horrible. I'm in and out of being inpatient, and so I take a leave of absence from school. Once I'm stabilized on meds, I go back, and then I was able to do academic renewal, and then stabilized on meds, and that I was able to do a really good job with my grades. But it's interesting. You can look at my transcripts and you can see the times when I wasn't properly treated, and that my grades are abysmal. There's some classes I just even quit just attending. And then, once I'm properly treated, it's a completely different picture here. As I mentioned, it's the above 4.0 semesters, really high GRE scores. It's like the same in grad school. I have my when I was doing well, I have a 4.0 in grad school, and then that semester where I wasn't, all of a sudden I'm dealing with that depressive cycle, and then end up having ECT. I was very fortunate. A lot of my professors worked with me to get incompletes and that, but that semester, there's incompletes and withdrawals. And it's the same with my PhD work too. I'm all but dissertation. It's like a 4.0, and then there's a semester where I get really sick again, and it's withdrawals. And so it does vary. I can't. One thing I learned was that I can't maintain grades while dealing with the illness. And high school was, high school I was in honor society and took the hardest classes I could, and that but I also never studied and never really did anything. High school was high school. I think I was allowed to just kind of go through, to be honest. My senior year, I just wandered the halls mostly. Tina probably remembers that.
Maybe I bumped into you out there. Karen, I'm wondering if you could, and I know we're we're running close to the end of time, but I would really love to hear an easy question for you. What are your goals and dreams and aspirations and fears right now in this moment?
Well, one thing is with the cognitive disorder, I'm on disability, and so that's one thing that's happened with the cognitive disorder. And so one thing, I won't be working again, and I won't be finishing my PhD, and I'm actually completely okay with that. I'm very fortunate for someone with my diagnosis. I got to teach at the college level, and I've presented at conferences, and I've been able to write some fun papers and that, and I'm totally okay with that. Right now, I just really want to watch my son grow up, and I feel like I'm entering kind of the second part of my life with the cognitive disorder. The cognitive disorder, there's good days and bad days, but you know, I'm having some positive responses. One of the meds I take because of the cognitive disorder is Namenda, which is an Alzheimer's medication, and I'm having some good response from that, where I can find words easier. My short-term memory is not the greatest, but so right now, watch my son grow up, support him the best I can, help him be just a healthy individual. There's so many there is a lot of stigma and a lot of preconceived ideas about people with mental illness and what kind of parent they can be, and I know that I'm the best parent possible for Max, so I think that's just where I'm meant to be right now.
That's awesome. Do we have any final questions for Karren that you'd like to ask?
I have one. You say that your mother and that your grandmother also had the disease. Were they not able to see some of the implications happening with you and get you help?
Oh God, no. My parents were very paranoid about getting mental health help. I remember one of the first times I was hospitalized here in Albuquerque. My dad said, "Well, they'll just lock you up and never let you out again," and they were just really paranoid about it. So they were and I should mention that they're not in treatment. They are, and also I should mention I have not had communication with my parents in 14 years. So, but yeah, they're, no, they really, there's kind of, there's kind of an older mindset that a lot of people still have, that we still would lock someone up against their will and never let them out again. And the thing is, to be quite honest, we don't have the money for that. What would more likely happen is that person would become homeless and put into jail. Not that they would be in a hospital. But there's that mindset. It's kind of like what I've kind of figured out about epilepsy. My grandmother is just totally distraught, thinking that my son's life is just there's going to be all these problems because he has epilepsy. And I'm just like, oh no, take his medication, we'll be fine. But there's kind of that older mindset, kind of like, we don't talk about this, and you don't let anybody know because they'll lock you up, and we don't talk about this. So, and that's very much how they were. So it was really I was really, a lot of times my parents would just be like when I'd just start crying uncontrollably or something like that, they'd just be like, what is your problem, and so I just start, a lot of times my biggest excuse was like, I'm just tired or something, to try to make it better. But yeah, they don't. And see, and that's why that's one thing I've told people, that if my son, say we get to his junior year in high school, and I start noticing some behaviors and some indicators that he's dealing with something, I'm probably the best person there to recognize those, and I know where to get him help and to support him in his help. And so if there's a parent for him, that's me. That's how I look at it, because I know how not to do it. I know how to do it. That's kind of how I look at it.
Anything else for Karen?
Huh?
Oh, I said, is there anything else for Karen? Any other questions that you might have? Final ones? Or Karen, maybe, is there anything that you would like to say to us that you feel that we need to know, or that you haven't covered?
Just, if you hear someone saying things like, oh, that's so schizo, or making jokes about that, don't be afraid to stop them and just nicely inform them that that's not, that's not the correct terminology, or that joke isn't really appropriate, or that, because it does help kind of break down the stigma of it all. So don't be afraid to do that. It does make a difference. It makes a big difference.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. Karen, thank you. I'll come back in.
Sure.
Thank you again for coming today. I just, and talking with us, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So
Not a problem.
really appreciate it. So let's get Karen to come here. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to end the meeting for now, but thank you so much again, Karen.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.